how do you rank order prioritize of like, all right, we are working with someone, they've hit a plateau, someone has come to us like, hey, I've hit a plateau in X, Y, or Z, whether it be strength gain, fat loss, or muscle gain. And maybe it's different for each. And maybe we go through where do you start with people, like kind of a checklist of like, okay, let's take a look at these variables first.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you have to start to look at what you are doing and ask questions, because to me, a plateau is a procedural error. What you're doing is not in alignment with what you're trying to derive from your training, right? And you mentioned it kind of comes down to stimulus, too much, too little. But sometimes I think people are just eliciting the wrong stimulus. Like they're chasing the wrong thing in hopes of getting something out of it that it will never produce. Right. So I think a big part of what brings on plateaus in training is a lack of willingness to change what you're doing. Because people will just, their only tool is a hammer. All they see is a nail, and they just keep trying to hammer these nails in. It's if you're trying to get strong and you keep doing what you perceive to be strength training, strength is an adaptation, but there are other adaptations that come in line before being maximally strong that you need to feed into that phase of strength training to make it most effective. So I think if you're just stuck in, and like barbell athletes are guilty of this probably more than anyone. Maybe you could look at sport specific training and think that too. It's like playing your sport isn't the only way to get better at your sport, but you still have to play your sport to get better at your sport. So it's understanding that there will be different phases of training, and you need to have a willingness to change what you're doing if you want to change the results that you're getting. Because what's going to take you from point A to point B, it's not going to get you from point B to point C to point D. And I think if you look at point A and point B as a progression, then that gives you a better understanding of the procedure that's going to get you from point B to point C. So sticking with that idea of becoming maximally strong, whether that's trying to increase your squat, your deadlift, your bench press, your snatch, your clean, your jerk, your 100-meter sprint, your 400-meter sprint, whatever that is, there's the thing that's going to be expressed, the expression of the training that you're doing, which is, Noah Lyles talking shit on the Canadian team, or, someone in the gym hitting a new 1 rep max back squat. That's the expression of the training that you've done up until that point. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the training that you have to do to get there is identical to the expression of that training, right? So I like to pull things from different models that I think are principle based, and they don't really change based off the application. And one of the things that I'll pull from kind of a traditional periodization model is the phases of training that you have to go through to be able to peak whatever form of athleticism that you're trying to train in the gym at a specific time. Because if it's a 100-meter sprint, I mean, I'm not a sprinting coach, and I'm not going to tell you how to do this, but I can pull principles out of training that can outline the process and what that should look like throughout the year, because these things don't really change when it comes to athletic expression. So if you're trying to better your 100-meter sprint, yes, there's going to be a formula that you need to go through that's going to take you from point A being where you are right now to point B being a lower sprint time. Or if you're trying to increase your 1 rep max deadlift, there's going to be a formula that's not very different in terms of concepts and variables, where it's going to take you from point A being whatever your deadlift is now to point B being a higher number in the deadlift. And that comes through different adaptations at different times. And an idea that I'll come back to, and I've said it probably 100 times on this podcast, is phase potentiation, right? The idea that the training you're doing right now is to elicit a specific adaptation that may not be identical to the expression of your end goal, but it's something that we can now build on top of to create a more meaningful adaptation in the next phase of training, and a more meaningful adaptation in the phase of training after that. And we're literally building that pyramid up to a higher peak. So it might start with something like muscular endurance in specific positions for a deadlift or for sprinting, whatever that might be. It might be something that looks nothing like the end goal, but there's positions that we need to be able to hold against a more meaningful stimulus or for a longer period of time. Or maybe we need to make sure that you have access to full range of motion in specific joint angles so that you can later express that as force production down the line. But those are two different adaptations, and we need to make sure that we have one before we can start training the next one. And I think once people start to understand that the expression of what they're looking for in terms of their specific goal is not what's going to get them to create those adaptations that are going to allow them to peak higher, then we can start to dissociate that train of thought that if I want to deadlift more, I just need to deadlift more. When in reality, if you want to deadlift more, you need to look at the entire process of what's going to get you to deadlift more. And I think for me, if someone comes to me and they say, all right, I have this plateau, what can I do to break through it? I'm just going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to ask them, what are you doing currently? Like, we have to understand the goal, of course, but what are you doing currently? What have you tried? And what has changed? Because I think that's the most important question, is what has changed? A lot of people, if you start to dig and you kind of ask a couple questions around that, I'm sure you'll find that someone that has reached a training plateau, they haven't tried anything new, or they've tried very novel pieces of maybe swapping out exercise selection, but they haven't really changed the intention around what they're doing much. So if you can get to the root of what has changed, what hasn't changed, then you can start to make more intentional changes to start to rebuild that pyramid. And I think people get attached to this idea that if I'm not constantly deadlifting or sprinting at a maximal capacity, I'm going to lose the ability to do that, when that's not necessarily the case. Is we need to be able to take a step back. Like if you look at like a periodization model, whether it's linear progression, wave loading, undulating progressions, like it literally looks like peaks and valleys. Like you'll see intensity, volume, whatever metric you're monitoring, you'll see it go up and then it comes down, and then it goes up, and then it comes down. And every one of those peaks and valleys in succession, they start to become a little bit higher. The valleys are going to be higher and the peaks are going to be higher. And you need to start at a low enough point to allow yourself enough time for that progression to play out and to elicit the adaptations, the specific adaptations of each phase of training, so that you can continue to stack those, so that eventually when you start to peak up, you're peaking higher than you've ever peaked before, and your valleys are going to be higher than they've ever been before as well. So that, in terms of just kind of rationale around training, I think that's where most people go wrong, is they're not looking at the correct variables to change in what they're doing and the intention behind those in their training, and that's why they run into plateaus.
Yeah, it's a lot of like, it's too general to be specific, but too specific to be general. I feel like when you look at people's exercise
Yeah.
programming, like, interference is a tough one, and it's a concept that likes that the people like to throw around. And again, it comes down to general versus specific. Like, if you the better you get, the more specific you're going to have to be, and the more concerted your efforts are going to have to be towards the goal you're trying to achieve, right? And I think a lot of times, when the people who I most often hear from about plateaus, they're they often have specific goals with a general approach,
Mm.
and that the general approach is going to work because general approaches are going to give you general adaptations, which are
Right.
sort of just going to raise your overall fitness. So I could, for example, I could, if I lost 20 pounds and I was looking to improve my 5K time, the very act of, that's a fairly specific goal. It is specific. There'd be a particular number in which I could run 5 kilometers. And then when I go to retest it, that number will either be, less or greater than what it was before. But if my approach is like, I run a few times a week, and then I lift 4 times a week, and then, I really dial my nutrition in, that'll work. That will definitely work. And it's definitely a general approach to a specific goal, because I've not really made any effort towards any of those things ever. So it's like, and then people love, they get this relationship with things that work for them. And much to your point, like they haven't tried anything new.